Can you all hear me okay? All right, cool. So my name is Nara Kasbergen. I'm here from Washington, D.C. And my talk is called Empathy as a Service, Supporting Mental Health in the Tech Workplace. And I'm actually going to save most of my self-introduction for the second part of the talk. I first want to cover some of the statistics and definitions and things like that related to mental health and mental illness to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page here. Then I'll go more into my own story and why this is so important to me. But then the bulk of the talk is really going to be focused on things all of us can do in our own workplaces and our own lives, common sense, action-oriented things that we can all put into action to support mental health better. And then there's a short section on the end on things that we all have to do together, where essentially it's more difficult and more aspirational, but still needs to be done. So first, what are we talking about? So if there's anything that I want you all to walk away from here with, it's this statistic. It's that 1 in 5 adults are living with mental illness at any given time. That's a huge number. In fact, it basically means that mental illness is one of the most prevalent chronic health conditions. But if you think about it, we really don't ever talk about it. And to be clear, when I say mental illness, I'm talking about any one of these. Some of these you may have heard of before, some of these you may not have. Another thing is there's this phenomenon called comorbidities, which means that when you have one of these illnesses, it also often makes you more prone to develop another illness. So for example, depression and anxiety often go together, depression and substance use disorder, ADHD and anxiety often go together, etc. Two that I wanted to kind of point out specifically are autism spectrum disorders and burnout. So autism spectrum disorders are kind of part of a bigger umbrella term of mental disorders, but they're often accompanied by other things like learning disabilities, sometimes also physical health issues, and so they often require their own kinds of treatments and interventions, etc. So organizations that focus on activism around mental health often focus either on some of the rest of these like depression and anxiety, or autism spectrum disorder specifically, just because those require more specialized treatments. And so I'm not going to talk too much about autism spectrum disorders today, because the organization that I work with is focused more on the other kinds of mental illnesses, but there's still quite a bit of overlap, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about is still relevant for autism as well. And then obviously we're going to be talking a lot about the workplace, so I wanted to call out the idea of burnout, especially in the United States where I come from. When the idea of burnout was introduced in the 1970s, there was quite a bit of pushback. People said, you know, that's silly, the whole idea that you can get sick from working too much. So I did some research and looked into, you know, where are we at in 2018? What does the research nowadays say? And most psychologists actually agree that burnout is actually depression. They did a lot of studies that show that at the end of the day, when they control for all kinds of factors, the symptoms are essentially the same. But it is essentially depression with a very specific cause, which is prolonged stress from working too much. So it's fine to continue to refer to it as burnout. We don't have to say depression necessarily. But I just figured, since we're going to be talking about the workplace, that is an important thing to know about. But a big problem with mental illness is that there's often kind of preconceived notions about what that means. So if I say mental illness to a random stranger, chances are they're going to think of something like schizophrenia. But in fact, depression in particular is one of the most common mental illnesses, and it's at least 13 times more prevalent than schizophrenia. Another big problem is there's lots of misunderstandings about things like the symptoms of depression. So we often associate it with things like feelings of sadness, emptiness, loss of interest and pleasure in normal activities, and tiredness and lack of energy. But there's actually a whole spectrum of emotions that's possible when you're suffering from depression. So it can also include things like angry outbursts and irritability, any kind of sleep disturbances, which can be insomnia or sleeping too much, any kind of changes in appetite and anxiety, agitation, or restlessness. And in fact, one thing that they're finding recently is that when women experience depression, they're much more likely to experience the feelings of sadness and emptiness and loss of interest and pleasure in normal activities, whereas when men experience depression, they're much more likely to have symptoms like the angry outbursts and irritability and anxiety, agitation, and restlessness. And so because we don't often associate those with depression, men are more likely to not even realize that they're suffering from depression. Another problem with depression in particular is that we tend to shame people for feeling this way. And a lot of people with depression often say that they'll hear things like, I can't believe you are feeling sad when kids in Africa are starving. And there's a rebuttal to this that does its rounds on the internet every couple of months that I think is really powerful, that says, telling someone not to be sad because others have it worse is like telling people they can't be happy because others have it better. Another really great illustration of the stigma against mental illness is from this webcomic called Robot Hugs. It's called Helpful Advice, and the subtitle here is If Physical Illness Were Treated Like Mental Illness. So just in case you can't read the captions, I'll read them out loud. On the left it says, I get that you have food poisoning and all, but you have to at least make an effort. On the right, you just need to change your frame of mind, then you'll feel better. Have you tried, not having the flu? I don't think it's healthy that you have to take medication every day just to feel normal. Don't you worry that it's changing you from who you really are? It's like you're not even trying. And while lying in bed obviously isn't helping you, you need to try something else. And all of the stigma and all of the shame is a really big problem because even in high-income countries like Iceland and the United States, anywhere from 35 to 50% of people with mental disorders do not receive any kind of treatment. And that's a problem because, for example, with severe depression, 15% of people will end up dying by suicide. So when the stakes are so high, you would think that people would speak up. But the reason they don't is because of fear. Things like fear of dismissal, fear of being taken out of promotion consideration, fear of being taken off high-value projects and contracts, fear of reduced hours for hourly workers, fear of being asked to take unpaid medical leave, and just in general, a fear of being treated differently. And another problem in the workplace, and especially in Western countries, is that we have this idea of you should leave your personal life at home when you come to work. But that doesn't work when you have mental illness. You can't just shut off your depression for 8 hours a day, come to work productively, and then come home and deal with your depression again. For better or worse, it's a part of you, and we have to do a better job of accepting people as their whole selves. So now I'll talk a little bit about myself and why I speak up about this. And I legitimately get asked this question a lot because I am a software engineer, just like all of you. I'm not a mental health professional. I've taken one psychology class in my entire life. I actually went to art school twice. I also identify as mentally healthy, and that makes me a little bit unusual because there are others who speak up about this topic, and they usually do so because they are living with mental illness themselves. But the reason why I speak up is because of her. This is my best friend, Nee. She and I met about 7 years ago when we were both living in New York City at the time. She had just moved there from Seattle. She had studied biochem in college, and her parents really wanted her to go to medical school. But she was interested in design and technology, and she convinced this company to give her a web development fellowship where she could basically learn the tools of the job on the job. So she and I hit it off immediately, became really close. And she was doing really well at work. And after about 1.5 years in New York City, she realized that the next best thing that she could do to advance her career was to move to San Francisco and work at a startup. So obviously, I was sad to see her go, but thanks to modern technology, we kept in touch and still talked all the time. But when she got to San Francisco, her imposter syndrome started becoming more of a problem, coming from kind of a non-traditional background in tech. And that was an issue because she had been living most of her adult life with bipolar disorder. But we thought she was doing okay. We thought she was doing better, and so it kind of took us all by surprise when in September 2016, she took her own life. So all of this is still really difficult for me to talk about, so if you really want to know more about this, I wrote a very long blog post about this on Medium last year. But after all of this happened, and after I had a little bit of time to kind of process this, I realized that I really wanted to turn my grief into action. I didn't want to just sit back and just continue to let this happen to people like me. And so I started volunteering with this organization called Open Sourcing Mental Illness, which was founded by this guy on the right, Ed Finkler. He had been part of the PHP conference speaker circuit for a number of years. And about 4 or 5 years ago, he started speaking up about his own experiences living with generalized anxiety disorder and ADHD and how that affected his life as a developer and his career in tech. And his talk actually resonated with a lot of people, and so they finally decided to form a whole organization around it, which is now an official 501c3 nonprofit in the United States called Open Sourcing Mental Illness, or OSMI. And so awareness campaigns are a really big part of what OSMI does, but we also have a research arm, We put out the survey every year called the Mental Health in Tech Survey, where we basically ask any and all of you who are working in the tech industry to answer these questions that allow us to gauge what the attitudes are towards mental health in tech. And every year, we'll change up the questions a little bit, but there's always kind of a variation of this one question, which shows us that we still have a lot of work to do. It's really two variations of one question. It's, do you think that discussing a physical health issue with your employer would have negative consequences? And do you think that discussing a mental health issue with your employer would have negative consequences? And so you can see on the left, for the physical health question, the no's make up pretty much 75% of all the responses. But on the right, for the mental health questions, the yeses and the maybes make up about 2/3 of the pie. That's a pretty striking difference and shows that we still have a lot of work to do. So I've been involved with OSMI for almost 1.5 years now, and I would say that my biggest contribution in this community as someone who is mentally healthy has been to sit back and listen to people like Ed tell their stories. And to try to empathize and think about what people like me can do. And there have been times when that's legitimately been tough. But there was a quote that Ed used in one of his talks that I thought was really powerful and that really kind of opened my eyes to how I really needed to approach this, which was, I could do so many awesome things if only my own head didn't get in the way. And the first time I heard this, it just really stopped me in my tracks because I realized my ability to do my job as a software engineer rests solely in my head. I don't need muscles, I'm not a construction worker. I really just get to go to work every day and take for granted that my brain is going to do everything that I tell it to do. But people like Ed can't do that. And so I started kind of thinking about, you know, what if this is how I felt as I went about my day? How would that change things, or how would my environment have to change in order to accommodate this better? And so that kind of led me down this path of thinking more about what can the rest of us do. And so to get started with that, I started just kind of characterizing the tech industry and thinking about what some of the unique kind of challenges and characteristics are. So things like the work is challenging and stressful, our jobs are highly collaborative, many of us have relocated for a job, most of us work remotely at least part of the time, we're often expected to be available outside work hours, someone needs to fix things when they break overnight, and there is a very heavy emphasis on drinking culture. And so I started thinking about relocation in particular, because as I had mentioned, my friend Nee had relocated twice in order to work in tech. And one of her friends mentioned at the funeral that she had mentioned to them recently that she kind of regretted not going back to Seattle, where her family was. And so I was thinking about this a lot and thinking, you know, it can't be all bad. There have to be legitimate reasons why we relocate. So I just kind of started approaching it from that angle, thinking about like what are the pros and cons. So on the positive side, it makes it much easier to feel like you're a part of the team and helping towards the mission if you're on site with everyone else. Or in Nee's case, it can bring you closer to a community of practitioners in your field compared to where you currently are. But on the negative side, it takes someone away from the existing support structures that they've already built up, like the therapist that they're seeing or the friend whose house they can come to at 1 in the morning because you really just need to have a good cry. Also, moving is generally always going to be stressful, and making new friends as an adult is surprisingly hard. So I started thinking about solutions, and I promise I'm going to focus more on pragmatic ones, but this first one is a little bit more aspirational. But I very strongly believe that as a community, we need to stop saying that the best way to succeed in tech is to relocate to Silicon Valley. That may have been true about 15 years ago, but I think things like remote work have come a long way, and we need to become a lot more accepting of alternative choices. If you are a manager, take another look at your hiring practices and see whether hiring remote-first employees is an option. And finally, if that's not an option, if someone does have to relocate to join your company, make sure that you focus on helping introduce that colleagues to organizations and events in the area after hours, essentially ways for them to start building up those support structures again. So I mentioned remote work as a positive, and I think in general it is very positive for mental health and people struggling with mental illness. For example, it often leads to more flexible hours, and that in turn is good because it makes it much easier to attend daytime therapy appointments. It turns out that therapists like to work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, like all of the rest of us. So if you want to start seeing a therapist, you're going to have to do that during the workday. And so a lot of people that I've talked to have said working from home on the day that you see your therapist is just so much easier because you can just kind of duck out with everyone knowing that you're going somewhere else. For similar reasons, it can also make it easier to stick to medication regimens. It's often easier to take breaks, and in general, it's more quiet and peaceful than being in the office. But on the negative side, there is a sense of isolation that sets in, especially if you're working from home 100% of the time. And I've had a couple of friends recently who have started working completely remotely. And it's always been interesting because the first couple of months, there's this kind of honeymoon phase where they're like, this is amazing. Why have I not been doing this my entire life? I love working in my pajamas. This is great. But then after about 2 months, that honeymoon phase kind of wears off and this sense of isolation sets in. And they start complaining that they're feeling lonely, they're missing the water cooler conversations, the connections with their colleagues, etc. And along those same lines, in general, working remotely can make it harder to build strong relationships with your coworkers, especially if you're the only one who's remote and everyone else is on site together. And even if you're not struggling with mental illness, but you just want to be a good supportive colleague, it can make it harder to tell if everyone's doing okay if you're mostly just communicating by Slack and the occasional Skype call. And it can also make it challenging to maintain a work-life balance, especially if you're truly working from home and your home is your office. I've heard from a lot of people that they just have difficulty saying, okay, it's 5 o'clock, I'm not going to respond to work emails and Slack anymore. So some of the solutions, co-working spaces, I think are excellent and really undervalued. And I think one of the biggest barriers to people trying it out is that there is often an initiation fee or a monthly fee that you have to pay. So a good solution for this is to have the company at the very least pay for the first month so that that person will be more likely to try it and see if it's for them. And to be clear, this is not something that you have to do every day. I've heard from a lot of people that even if they just go into a co-working space once a week, it's still helpful and makes them feel less isolated. Also, make sure you occasionally fly in remote employees or hold company-wide offsites to make sure everyone feels like they're a part of the team and they're getting a chance to bond. And finally, there's just so much research happening around remote work culture and how to make it better that there's so many resources that you can leverage. There's whole conferences around this now. So just look into kind of what the latest kind of state-of-the-art around remote work is. Try some things with your team if you find that you're still struggling. And see if it works for you, and if not, try something else. There's just so many things to try. So the first time that I was going to give this talk, one of the things that surprised me the most was someone came back and said, so what about Openplan offices? What are you planning to say about that? And I actually had not planned on saying anything at all. But so I figured, okay, this is a good question, so let me do some research. So on the positive side, they are more conducive to collaboration, creative problem solving between multiple employees, people having more organic conversations that lead to solutions that no one had thought of on their own, etc. I used to think that that's why everyone did it, but it turns out that it's actually because it's just easier to construct offices that way because of things like building fire codes. It can increase a sense of team unity or camaraderie, but I really want to emphasize the can here because if there's already friction on the team, then it can actually increase resentment instead. But on the negative side, the #1 complaint about Openplan offices is the noise and how it reduces productivity. From a mental health perspective, I think the biggest concern is the lack of privacy. When I talked about remote work before, when I said, working from home makes it easier to duck out in the afternoon for your therapy appointment, this is kind of the exact opposite, right? You're working very closely with everyone. So if you need to duck out for the therapy appointment, everyone's going to know about it. People also have cited an increased sense of stress, and there's also increased peer pressure. And this is a problem for mental health because I think it happens quite often to us as developers where sometimes we just get stuck. And we realize that the absolute best thing that we can do for ourselves is just to take a break for maybe 20 minutes, go take a walk around the block, do something completely different. But what often happens in Openplan offices is you look around and everyone else is bent over their desks and they look productive. And what happens in that case is you talk yourself out of taking that break. And that's actually the worst possible thing that you can do for yourself in that moment. And finally, Openplan offices are also highly conducive to the spread of physical disease like the cold, the flu, etc. So again, I'm focusing on pragmatic solutions. So I'd love to come up here and say we should not have Openplan offices anymore, but I think the vast majority of us are not in the position to make that call. So then the next easiest and best thing to do is to make sure that everyone is allowed to work remotely, or if they are already, maybe increase the number of days per week or per month when they can do so. Also, regardless, always urge your employees to work from home when they're sick. Don't have them bring the cold or the flu into the office. Maybe try setting aside small meeting spaces for quiet work. I work in a pretty big office, and I think for those of us with big offices, one thing that happens is there's always that one conference room that's actually too small to have a productive meeting in. So maybe just set that one aside for people to check out for like an hour if they realize that they just need a bit of quiet time in the afternoon where they can get some productive work done. Also have the company provide noise-canceling headphones. This is often the easiest solution that everyone turns to first, and it does work pretty effectively. And then finally, encourage employees to decorate their workspace. And this might sound on the surface like it has nothing to do with improving offices and productivity at all, but the research actually says the opposite. There was a 2014 study done in Sweden where they tested out different office configurations, and they had the people who worked in them basically rate how these office configurations made them feel. And the one that was rated the worst, interestingly enough, especially among men, was the Openplan Flex office, which is an Openplan office where no one has their own desk. And there was a 2010 study that was done in the UK where they compared people who had decorated and personalized their workspace and people who hadn't, and they found that the people who had decorated their workspaces were actually 1/3 more productive. So as silly as it sounds, these life hacks actually work. And then alcohol tech events. So this is kind of a controversial one, but let me go through the kind of positives and negatives first. So 1 or 2 drinks can make it easier for some introverts and those with social anxiety to socialize with their peers, and I'm guilty of this myself. And the next one is a bit of a positive negative, but if you don't offer alcohol, then those who want to drink will go to a bar instead of staying to mingle with others at your event. So conferences like this one, that's often the reason why they say they have alcohol. They want everyone to stay here and kind of socialize and network, because that's the whole point of why we're having conferences like this. But on the negative side, it makes non-drinkers feel unwelcome in general. And if you're a recovering alcoholic, then you're definitely going to feel threatened by the kind of event where alcohol is flowing freely. And to be clear, alcoholism is substance use disorder, is a mental illness. And in general, free alcohol and drinking culture are so pervasive that there are probably more functioning alcoholics in tech than we're even aware of. So some of the solutions, I personally am uncomfortable saying no one should ever have alcohol at tech events again. I think there's like intermediate steps that we can try in the meantime. One thing that some places have tried that actually work pretty well are, for example, making sure that you always offer nice alternatives. Things like the fancy sodas that come in the glass bottles or even mocktails, to make sure that non-drinkers feel like they're included. I've heard from several non-drinkers that often the biggest insult to them is to get to the after party and everyone else is getting like customized cocktails and they just get some like lukewarm sodas where they have to like fill their own ice. So make sure that you're treating everyone equally. Also put a limit on the number of free drinks that you give out. Use some kind of ticket or token system. And people usually do this for budget reasons, but it ends up working out well for health reasons as well, because the way it usually works is you'll get like 2 free drink tickets, and after that it turns into a cash bar. But what that leads to is someone will have their 2 free drinks, and they'll be thinking about, do I want to take out my wallet to pay for that 3rd drink? And what often happens then is that they'll realize, actually, I have a pretty good buzz going, and maybe I don't need that 3rd drink. So then they're not getting drunk, and you don't have to deal with those kinds of health consequences. Also, always make sure that you have activities other than drinking. It turns out that there's a pretty big overlap between developers and people who like playing board games. So you would think that more tech events would have things like a board game night. If you're having a recurring series of events like a weekly company happy hour or a monthly meetup, maybe just try alternating dry and non-dry events. So don't cut out the alcohol completely, but you don't have to do it every single time. And then finally, add workplace wellness programs on substance abuse. I think these are the kind of thing where most of us will roll our eyes at them when they happen, but research has shown that they're actually relatively effective. It turns out that most of us just need that periodic reminder that there are serious consequences to drinking too much, and that reinforcement is just very helpful. For managers and tech leads and senior devs, I think overall the biggest piece of advice is just to lead by example. Things like not micromanaging, leaving the office on time, taking regular vacations yourself, not sending or answering emails at 2 a.m. if possible, Being receptive to feedback on your own performance, in addition to giving people feedback on their performance, and being a good listener. And really the only thing that I would say that's kind of unique to mental health is that you should try to be more open to talking about your own health, or mental health, or maybe something that happened in your family. Because it turns out that really your #1 goal should be for your employees or your reports to come to you and say, hey, look, I'm struggling with this issue, I might need an accommodation, that sort of thing. But people are not going to do that if you haven't been a little bit more vulnerable and open about some things that you yourself have struggled with. So it sounds really counterintuitive. I feel like most of us, by the time that we get to like that senior level, we feel like we should be completely invincible, but actually being vulnerable is probably one of your best assets. Some other action items for managers: make sure your employees understand their benefits and what mental health treatments are covered. Revisit your hiring practices with an eye to mental illness and neurodiversity, and I'll talk more about neurodiversity in a minute. Make sure employees feel valued and are on projects that they find fulfilling and empowering. And this might sound on the surface like it has nothing at all to do with mental health, but I would say like this is the single biggest takeaway for me in my time with OSMI and listening to other people tell their stories, is that I've noticed a trend that when people are saying like, I feel like my depression is starting to come back, I feel like my symptoms are getting worse, it's often accompanied by a change at work. So they got put on a different project, they feel like they're not getting as many opportunities to give feedback or make changes in the process, the management is just not being transparent about why they're doing this, et cetera, et cetera. So making sure people feel valued and are feeling fulfilled is actually really important for mental wellness as well. Get the OSMI handbooks. They are on the OSMI website, but you can also get them directly from LeanPub. 2 of them deal with the Americans with Disabilities Act, so they're probably only relevant if you're in the US, but the 3rd one talks about how to start a mental wellness program in your workplace, and that would be a great one for everyone here to check out. And then finally, consider offering the mental health first aid training. So mental health first aid is this international program that was started in Australia and is available in all of these countries in Europe, the US, and Canada, I believe in India and Nepal as well. It's either 8 hours or 12 hours, and the whole focus of it is to basically teach you how to respond if you encounter someone having a mental health crisis. And I've heard from many people that they found it very useful as a sort of empathy training essentially as well. So if you're trying to find sort of the most effective way to really truly get everyone to respond to mental health better in your company, this is probably the best thing that you can do. It can sometimes be challenging to actually attend a training. They're often kind of limited in where and when they're given. If you're based in Iceland, obviously it's not even one of the countries on the list, but what you can do is actually bring in a trainer to give the training on site. And that's a great way. It's often even cheaper than just having one person attend the training by themselves. So that's a great way to make sure that all of your employees get trained, or everyone on the management team get trained, et cetera. So finally, I'll spend just a couple minutes talking about the stuff that we all have to do together, where everyone has to do their part. The first really big thing is making sure that we're always supporting marginalized people in the tech industry. And this is important because chronic harassment, bullying, and microaggressions can lead to depression, exacerbate eating disorders, and cause or worsen other mental illnesses. And people are often surprised when I mention eating disorders in the context of tech. They're like, well, we're not models, we're not actresses. Why does it matter how you look? But it turns out that even in tech, women are still judged by their appearance. In sort of the Silicon Valley startup culture in particular, I've heard a lot of stories about women being told things like, oh, you only got this interview because you're pretty. And so if you're already suffering with issues of body image and eating disorders, this is just going to make it worse. And in general, people from marginalized groups often feel like they have to overperform because there's this whole myth of the bar having to be lowered in order to allow them into tech in the first place. And so that overperforming leads to increased stress and a much greater likelihood of burnout. We also need to fully embrace neurodiversity. So neurodiversity is this idea that mental disorders like ADHD and autism in particular are the result of natural variations of the human genome. They say that people with these kinds of differences do not need to be cured, they need help and accommodation instead. So to be clear, the strongest proponents of neurodiversity say that we should actually stop looking for a cure for autism altogether. I think that's a little bit controversial, and I think it's probably worth it to keep looking for a cure for autism. But I also recognize that even if we do find a cure, it's probably only going to help the people who aren't born yet. Chances are it's not going to help anyone who is living with autism right now, which means there are multiple generations of people with autism who deserve to live healthy, happy, productive lives and be contributing members to society. And it's in our own interest as well, because some of our greatest inventions are attributed to people with atypical neurology. Ed Finkler himself has this quote he likes to use in his talks where he says, "Mental illness gives me superpowers." He talks about how his ADHD in particular allows him to make connections faster than a lot of other people and understand whole systems, see solutions that they hadn't thought of before. And there was this article in the Harvard Business Review from last May called Neurodiversity as a Competitive Advantage, where they actually found the same thing. They found that people with autism who are working at companies like IBM and Hewlett-Packard were actually incredibly productive, thinking of solutions no one had thought of, et cetera. And the biggest barrier was actually bringing them into the companies in the first place. They had to essentially change up their interview process to allow these people to enter these kinds of companies. And so finally, some of the things we can only change as a culture, the whole idea of working ourselves to death, the overemphasis on hard work and stigma against vacation, and things like the best programmers always code on the holidays, that kind of idea. The need to always be available by phone or email. I go to Iceland to speak at a conference like this, and I always feel pressure to tell everyone how to reach me in case of an emergency, and that shouldn't need to be the case. The peer pressure caused by social media. There have been some studies done recently about Facebook in particular, and they found that people suffering from depression struggle a lot with using Facebook because everyone just posts about the good things that happen in their lives. And so seeing everyone else seemingly happy with their weddings and their babies, et cetera, just makes them feel worse and even more down on themselves. I mentioned this before, but the belief that you must be in Silicon Valley to succeed, I don't think that's true in 2018 anymore. The stigma against talking about our feelings, and finally the idea that engineers don't have empathy. And this was kind of a new thing for me, maybe because I went to art school, but I was talking to a woman who had started her own business, and she was saying that she brought in this consultant who said, you can never use the word empathy around your engineers because they all believe that they don't have it. And so that was incredibly strange to me because empathy is something that we all have the capacity for, we just have to choose to exercise it. And there was a quote that the same woman used in a talk that she gave that I thought was really powerful, that was, empathy is the antidote to shame. And she actually mentioned this in the context of the shame and blame culture of tech, but I think it's very true for mental illness as well, where the shame here really is the stigma against mental illness, and so empathy is the antidote. And that all brings me back to the title of my talk, Empathy as a Service. Hopefully you figured out by now that this is kind of in jest. There is no app for this. We can't deploy it to the cloud. We can't automate it away. This is something that we all have the capacity for, and we have to choose to exercise it as a service to each other. And if you're struggling with how to do this, I just bring you back to the quote from Ed's talk that really helped me, which was, I could do so many awesome things if only my own head didn't get in the way. And so I have a list of resources that will be in my slides. I'm not going to go through these, but feel free to ask me if you want to know more about what any of these are for. And feel free to reach out anytime with thoughts, questions, etc. And I always tell people, like, even if like 6 months from now you're like, man, I really want to talk about this, my proverbial door is always open. So please come talk to me. And then finally, before I forget, I do have OSMI stickers, so come talk to me afterwards if you want one of those. So thank you very much.